Welcome to Biblically Speaking. My name is Cassie Bellino, and I'm your host. In this podcast, we talk about the Bible in simple terms with experts, PhDs, and scholarly theologians to make understanding God easier. These conversations have transformed my relationship with Christ and understanding of religion. Now, I'm sharing these recorded conversations with you. On this podcast, we talk about the facts, the history, and the translations to make the Bible make sense so we can get to know God, our Creator, better. Hello. Welcome to Biblically Speaking. My name is Cassie Bellino, and I'm your host. I am so pleased to have Dr. James Sedlacek back again. And if you've been listening to Biblically Speaking, you know him, you love him, you've heard him in many of our most popular episodes. Recently talking about Torah living, you came on and famously talked about misinterpreted verses and misunderstood Bible. You've talked about the bleeding woman and made me fall in love with that character and her entire story. You've connected Jewish texts and how we went from Judaism to Christianity. You are such a treasure to have on the show. And now you're back here to talk about divorce. And I'm going to be honest, I'm not divorced. I don't know many people divorced, thank God. But I think it's a topic worth exploring simply because what's allowed? Why are we not allowed to get divorced? Are the scenarios? And even in the ones where it's just a bad marriage, is it wrong to divorce that? I have so many questions. So I'm glad that you're here, Dr. Sedlacek. Welcome to the show yet again.
Thank you, Cassie, and it's always a pleasure to be on your podcast and interact with you and others that have been on the show and ask questions. It's always been a pleasure to answer questions, and it's always fun to explore text and explore intersection between one text and another. And I'm always keen for those kind of details that get missed a lot. And I like to bring them out because sometimes they clue us in on some things that we're often skimming the surface on.
Yeah, you're good at that. I'm so glad you pick up on that because I definitely don't. When it comes to divorce, this was a topic that you suggested because, again, it's something that just goes over my head. I'm not thinking about it. I'm not looking for it. But we know of those verses where, a woman that is divorced, what is allowed. It's usually because there's adultery. But that's like all I know. So how did you even stumble upon this topic?
Yes, when examining like the Torah passages on divorce and remarriage, and then also Jesus' statements on it, a lot of times you come into like this will form the theological position for a church when they're trying to decide what they want their members to be like or what they want their pastors to be like, and these will be written in rules. But the same token, do they really understand what Jesus is talking about or what he's reacting to when he spoke? And that's kind of what sparks my interest when I read the passages such as in Mark or Matthew.
Interesting. So are you saying that we're maybe taking something that Jesus said and taking it to the nth degree or just completely misinterpreting it?
I think it's been misinterpreted a lot accidentally. And then, because people are used to the misinterpretations, then they react to the misinterpretation, sometimes going the other way too far. Just because they know the misinterpretation's wrong, they want to swing the other way, and you start getting this whole pendulum thing when it comes to the...
Mm-hmm.
And it's hard to know, well, what was it that Jesus was actually saying, dealing with?
When you approach these, how do you know what Jesus meant if we've been missing it this whole time? Like, what is your approach to really dissecting this?
Yes, one of the things I do in my studies is I connect with known Jewish sources on various topics: rabbinic literature, Talmudic material, Mishnaic material, because it often gives a clue to what is going on in the background. One of the first steps of biblical interpretation is to know the background for each statement in the text. The better you know the background to that happening, whatever it is, the better you understand what's really happening in the scenario. And one of the things we're good at in Western Christianity is taking our favorite verse out, making a whole theology around that verse and running with it, not
Yep.
realizing what it meant. And so what was its historical meaning can only be uncovered if we pay close attention to the historical background.
I feel like you inch your way through the word. Like you just go word by word. And I'm over here trying to like run through whole chapters and you're like, I've spent a week on this one verse. Would you say that's true?
I would say even more smaller than word sometimes, but yes. It's like,
Oh my
oh, wait a
gosh.
minute. Oh, wait a minute. Look at that thing hanging on the end of that word. What's that doing there?
Yes, yes. I mean, because I remember when we were talking about the misinterpreted verses, you're like, if it, sometimes just the manuscripts were so disintegrated that it almost like a corner that would miss a certain element of a letter that without that now disintegrated, it's a completely different letter. So now we're interpreting this as a completely different word.
It's possible. That happens sometimes, yes.
That's pretty scary. Okay, so today's goals are really just to re-clarify what we think Jesus was originally trying for us to convey rather than read our own interpretation into it and what we believed. And I am truly curious. I mean, by no means do I ever want to divorce my future husband, but I also don't want to do it. I want to do it if I need to without being sinful. So that's what we're trying to do is really find those borderlines, those guardrails to this discussion. But before we get into it, let's start off with what does the Bible say about divorce? My understanding of it, my Sunday school mentality that I like to call it, that person that just goes to church on Sundays, just goes on the holidays, thinks that they're a Christian because they go to church and maybe a Bible study even. I understand divorce as if you cheat, then you've got grounds for divorce. But of course, you've got abuse. You've got horrible people that got married. What do you mean I can't divorce them just because they haven't cheated on me? So am I reading that correctly?
Well, I think you've touched on a popular area of exploration based on reading Matthew alone in isolation from the other texts. Let me read
Yep.
Matthew for us first. Some Pharisees came to Jesus, testing him and asking, "Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any reason at all?" Now, I want to pause after those words and let those last four words sink in, because what they're asking him, can they get a divorce for any imaginable reason? They're not asking him if they can get a divorce for a specific reason, but for any reason at all. That's a broad, wide open question. Now, the Pharisees, said to him, "Why then did Moses," and this is after he answers the first part, "why then did Moses command to give her a certificate of divorce and send her away?" He said to them, "Because of your hardness of heart, Moses permitted this. But I say to you, whoever divorces his wife except for immorality and marries another woman commits adultery." So as you read that passage, the only reason Jesus stated was adultery or immorality as the reason, the grounds for divorce. And so it's very easy to come away from that and build a backwards case. Since that's the only reason Jesus said, then that's the only reason that's legitimate. And I want to suggest that that isn't a complete reading of the biblical matter on divorce. That's reading Matthew in isolation. Mark also records this same encounter. And I want to read Mark and let the words of Mark bounce off what we just read from Matthew. Some Pharisees came up to Jesus, testing him. It's interesting. Now we know it's a test of some kind. Well, what do we use tests for in the first place? To see if somebody is legitimate, to see if somebody's, recently, 3 months ago, you're testing people to see if they're Republican or Democrat. I don't know if you do that or not. But anyway, these kind of things happen, right? So this is a test. Jesus is on this side or that side. Well, what possible two sides could he be on? That's a question that we don't get answered just by reading Mark. We know it's a test, but what are
And
the
you think it's
two
a binary
things?
test? Like he's either one thing or another?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Maybe
Okay.
there's a three-way here because we'll introduce the
Okay.
situation. But yeah, there's at least a strong binary polar thing that they're worried about, but there's a possible third-party candidate. Since
How
we
would
just
I know that? That's insane. Okay. What?
Yeah.
Okay. Keep going.
All right. And so in the house, the disciples asked Jesus more about this. Now, if something's going to be a problem, you expect the Pharisees to ask Jesus something, and then the disciples go, wait a minute, what was that all about? And they did.
Yeah.
So, if his disciples are asking him more questions, maybe it wasn't that clear to them.
I am them. It is not clear.
It's not clear, right?
The disciples are there to represent me because I'm also lost.
And listen to Jesus' answer to his disciples. Whoever divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery against her. No reason given. Matthew gave a reason. Grounds of legitimate divorce was immoral behavior. Mark doesn't even let us know that. It's just anybody who divorces and remarries is now committing adultery. They're both talking about the same story. Mark left out the reason that was grounds for a good divorce. Matthew included it. Who's to say Matthew didn't include all of them? If Mark didn't include any, Matthew included one. The fact that Matthew included one doesn't rule out that there's not more than one.
Oh my gosh.
And there are. And they're in the Torah.
Oh my gosh. Of course. Of course that's where the answer is.
They're in the Torah. There's more than one reason. There's several.
Okay.
There are several reasons that are grounds for a good divorce. Now, the other thing that I want to suggest to you here is that there's stages of a Jewish marriage, and there's likewise stages of a divorce in a Jewish marriage. And until the thing is complete, nobody's supposed to be getting married to somebody else. And if
there's stages to get to marriage is the goal, and there's stages before you're even getting married, and the same with divorce. There's stages before you can even get divorced.
Yeah. There's stages, there's procedure. And if you don't get the final approval, we'll jump to it. It's called a get in Jewish culture when you get a divorce. And this is when the rabbi has examined the Torah and everything else to show that this divorce is fine. It meets all the criteria. It's not a frivolous divorce. It is not something that violates the Torah in any way. It's a solid divorce. There's real grounds for this divorce. And when they get a get, when they get one of those, that marriage is final. It is done, and the parties are free to marry. Without that thing, they are still legally married. And
which is why it's adultery.
This is the gray area. This is the fuzzy zone. This is the place where you don't want to be getting remarried. People could go get a civil divorce, but until they got the get from their rabbi, they weren't divorced in the eyes of God yet.
Then what's a civil divorce?
The state court, or the justice of peace, if you will. Someone who says, oh, yeah.
Like a secular separation.
$300, I'll file the divorce papers, and now we're good. The rabbi's saying, that's not a legitimate divorce. This is frivolous. This isn't even meeting any of the criteria given in the Torah. So there's the rabbinic approval of the divorce process called a get. And until that thing is in hand, they're still legally married.
Jeez.
And so, yeah. And so this is why Jesus is saying, unless you've got one of those grounds, you're not getting to the get. You're not getting to the thing that actually guarantees that you have the liberty to remarry.
So what are the stages?
Yeah, we can talk about those. In Judaism, there are stages of the Jewish wedding. The first is the kiddushin. It's like a betrothal. A similar thing in English culture would be the engagement.
Okay.
Then there's the nisuin. This is the completion, the following through of everything. We sometimes translate that as the consummation. In short, the families have all come together. They have signed off on this thing. There's a formal exchange of vows before family, and the bride and groom go off to the wedding chamber. Then it's nisuin. It's done. It's
Got it.
consummated, and that's the second stage. Well, you could have somebody who's in the first stage of a wedding. Nobody's supposed to be getting involved with them or getting second contracts with them until they have either been dropped from the kiddushin stage. Like something could happen. The bride and groom could examine themselves and realize we're not compatible. We need to break this thing off. And the kiddushin is broken. Well, there's not going to be a nisuin. They're done. Now they're free to go make a kiddushin with somebody else. But that's the stages, the kiddushin and the nisuin. It's not that different, really. There's nitty-gritty things that are different between an engagement and a wedding. But we think in English culture that the wedding is that final stage only. In Jewish culture, it begins at the kiddushin. So not everybody that's getting married in the biblical text have actually consummated the wedding yet. We have to keep that in mind and realize some of these are entering the stage of kiddushin when we're reading about them in the text. Some of them are entering the stage of nisuin when we're reading about them in the text. And you have to have a fine eye to catch that difference, and sometimes it's not stated what stage they're in. But then you have to give a person the benefit of the doubt that they might be at this stage and not this stage, and not hold your interpretation too rigid on that text.
Yeah, the only example that I can really think of is like Joseph and Mary.
Exactly. That's a good example where we can see the stages. And our New Testaments are pretty clear that there's a betrothal, and Joseph knew not his wife, so he did not enter nisuin with his wife. It's pretty clear. She's still his wife.
Yeah.
But there's no nisuin yet. And nobody's supposed to be getting involved. Now, when he agrees to dismiss her privately, in his heart, he didn't do it, but he was thinking this in his heart, what he's doing is wanting to break off the kiddushin. They've never had nisuin yet.
Got it.
The angel of the Lord says, no, take her for your wife. Wait a minute, she's already his wife. Yeah, kiddushin, but not nisuin. The angel of the Lord is telling him nisuin.
Like they're engaged, but they have not consummated it yet. And even after Jesus was born, they still waited.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And the exact date of the nisuin doesn't matter in terms of whether it's going to be or not. Joseph was, after the visit by the angel, he's comfortable to go on to nisuin. It's what God asked him to do. So through the angel. So he's more comfortable. In that case, we can see the phases, but we often misinterpret them because we don't realize that they are husband and wife at kiddushin by Jewish understanding, and then they're not consummated yet. So they need a different approach to break off a kiddushin than a divorce. Even though our text says he wished to divorce her secretly, it's not really a divorce yet. That's a Western interpretation.
Okay, so you're saying when we read the text, when they're in the kiddushin and they break it off, and maybe they use the word divorce, but that's really just ending an engagement versus like once they have consummated neshim. I'm sorry, what is the word?
Nisuin.
Nisuin. Once they break that off, that is divorce.
They have to go through a formal divorce process.
And then the divorce has stages?
Yeah, 2. Yeah. So the wedding has 2. The kiddushin is done between families. The nisuin is overseen by the rabbi, but then again the families are in agreement and the consummation takes place. There's a 7-day feast that goes along with the wedding, where the bride and groom are in their chamber and the families are celebrating. So that's part of the nisuin. Not at the kiddushin. Kiddushin is a time for the families to start bartering with each other.
Got it.
They're making deals. And the bride and groom are either in agreement with these or they're not, and then they'll say so. But there's a lot of deals that get made in the kiddushin phase between families, because they're bringing 2 families together in this wedding. Even though it's about the couple, it's also about the 2 families coming together, and sometimes business deals will be made, or all kinds of agreements will be made. And so when the kiddushin is broken, it still has to go out to the families and say, hey, we're breaking this thing off. You might as well dissolve this business relationship. You might as
Oh,
well. It could be impactful. It depends. Or, they may not dissolve that business relationship if it's still good with the families not going through the wedding. But the question is social, not moral. When you go to
got it.
the divorce and you have a consummated wedding, then you have to go through formal divorce because the issue of morality then becomes a more important question, because there needs to be grounds for this divorce. In other words, you just don't do frivolous divorces.
Got it. Okay. What are the
Kiddushin
stages of
breaking.
divorce?
Yeah, let's talk about those stages.
And almost
So,
like what warrants a non-frivolous reason? What warrants that divorce?
sure. Let me go over some of the reasons in the Torah, because we hinted at that earlier and we haven't mentioned them yet.
Running my own podcast, I'm always moving too fast. I'm finding guests, I'm editing episodes, I'm creating reels, or guesting on other shows. Not to mention, I just live in a world that moves fast. Notifications, trends, endless to-do lists. You know what feels like a blessing in all that? Slowing down. I'd love nothing more than a moment to pause, be present, and choose something timeless. That's exactly what Dwell Label is all about. When I first discovered Dwell Label, it wasn't just about the clothes. It was about a mindset. Thoughtful, intentional fashion that doesn't scream for attention, but instead invites you to slow down. Their pieces are modern takes on classic styles, made to last, not just for the season, but for years. I love that I can throw on a Dwell Label outfit for editing in a coffee shop, Bible studies, or looking professional in an interview. It always feels right. Comfortable, effortless, elevated. And here's the best part. Dwell Label does not just talk about rest. They live it. Their website literally doesn't work on Sundays because they believe in pausing and dwelling on what matters most. So if you're looking for high quality, timeless fashion that aligns with a lifestyle of intention and presence, I can't recommend Dwell Label enough. Shop Dwell Label with the link in the show notes and use my code BIBSPEAK15, BIBSPEAK15 for an exclusive discount at checkout. Take a breath, slow down, and dwell in the good things. Now, back to the show.
So Deuteronomy 24:1 is a passage that's often cited in the Torah for divorce, but it's also misunderstood a lot. When a man takes a wife and marries her, and it happens that she finds no favor in his eyes because he's found some indecency in her, and he writes her a certificate of divorce. Well, it goes on a little ways from there, but a lot of times the interpretation around indecency is very vague.
Mm-hmm.
How do you decide what that includes? Well, there's two interpretations historically among the rabbis on what that means. Some have interpreted it anything that the husband found indecent, whatever his imaginations about indecency are. This actually puts women at risk for frivolous divorces, because what is indecent in that guy's eyes? The
Right.
other interpretation is if it's indecent by the Torah. In other words, it has to be something the Torah specifies, and the man found it, okay, but we're going to find out if it's really something in the Torah or not before we say go or not go on this divorce. So that's one verse that sometimes gets wiggled into debates, and debate we're going to look at is related to that very verse between the famous rabbis. And it's the very reason that the Pharisees asked Jesus what to do. The other one is in Exodus 21:10 and 11. If he takes to himself another woman, he may not reduce her food, her clothing, or her conjugal rights. If he will not do these three things for her, then she shall go out for nothing without a payment of money. That's an odd thing. It's like, what's going on here? Well, normally the groom paid a sum of money to the bride, and if she were going to break off this wedding, a consummated wedding, then she would have to pay back this price. If it was something that was just not being provided, well, if it was, she wasn't happy with the guy, just general unhappiness. Because to take the money and say, well, I'm getting married, and then, oh, I don't like the way your nose goes to the right, I'm going to run off with the money now. would then be a violation of money rights, I guess. So this law in Exodus 21 is saying for these grounds, she doesn't need to give back the money. She can keep it. This is her right to keep it because he's not providing for her. And
Oh,
so,
okay.
yeah, it's not her rights that are seemingly scratched on here. It's his. He's losing his right to get that money back because he isn't taking care of her. And so basic husbandly provision, if he's not doing his duty to provide, she can divorce and doesn't have to pay back the money. That's interesting because that's a lot broader than cheating.
Right.
This is basic humanitarian. Okay, you're living under my roof. I need to put clothes on you. I need to feed you. I need to do all of these things because you're in my tent. And if I'm not, then I don't have any rights to claim to be, especially husband-like too. And so she's free to go.
And that is essentially kind of painting the role for the man to provide.
It
And
does
if he
kind
falls
of do
short
that.
of that role, then she has that ability to leave.
This is the clause that gets into abuse situations and allows the abused to get out of that marriage legally with rabbinical approval and get the get.
Got it.
And it's not the one Jesus mentioned in Matthew, but it's there in the Torah, and it certainly allows for divorces under these circumstances.
Kind of like on our conversation with like, okay, well, if like Jesus mentions it and if it's repeated in the New Testament, then it's probably true. Is there any issues with bringing something from the Torah into the New Testament here? With like, okay, under New Covenant laws, some things were left in the Old Testament. This is in the New. Are there any issues that we can that we should be aware of?
I tend to take a little different view on New Testament use of Old Testament material. First of all, the Old Testament is this thick, while the New Testament is this thick.
Right.
It can't tell you everything that's in the Old Testament. And
Okay.
for the New Testament to not include it, it's not reason enough to exclude it. If the New Testament contradicts it, then I'm more favorable to rethinking the issue. But for the most part, the New Testament is written by Jews to Jews. We Gentiles who have been reading it and enjoying it have been listening in behind the door, like Sarah at the tent when the angels of the Lord come in. And if it's written by Jews to Jews in the first century, they wouldn't be just automatically upturning the Torah. That would not be something that was typical. A lot of the overturning of the Torah has come into Christian theology due to some of the misunderstandings of the 3rd and 4th centuries between Christian church fathers and Jewish rabbis. And it pulled apart societies that got along better than they used to. But Jesus is actually responding to a well-known debate that had entrenched almost political parties on this issue of divorce about 100 years before him. And these Pharisees who ran up to him were simply trying to figure out if he was leaning this way or leaning that way in that debate. That's really what they wanted to know, and that's really what he was referring to. He was not laying out a general theology of divorce and remarriage.
So what are the two spectrums that was the binary?
Yes, the first is Rabbi Hillel, a Sadducee rabbi, who had a very lenient interpretation on the Torah. That Deuteronomy verse that we read earlier about the man finding something indecent in his eyes, he said just about anything he can imagine can fit in that indecency. If
Right.
he didn't like the way her eyes looked one day, that's indecent, and he can divorce her. Well, that puts a lot of women in a bad place if their men can just pitch them for any reason at all. But then when it comes around to them not liking the way their man's ear is shaped, okay, they don't have the same thing. It becomes an imbalance. But if it's read correctly, there's no imbalance here between what the men and the women can perceive as going in their favor. Rabbi Shammai was a Pharisee rabbi. He was not a Sadducee. He was a Pharisee. And both of them were the principal head of the Sanhedrin. Hillel was first, and he had many debates with Shammai. When Hillel passes or retires, Shammai becomes the principal head of the Sanhedrin. One of the rare times that a Pharisee actually ran the Sanhedrin. Pharisees were always a minority party in the Sanhedrin. It was rare for them to be leading it. Well, Shammai leads it for a while, till his death. And so, but these two rabbis were bigger than life when you get to the first century. These were the classic debates that were in people's mind. And so new rabbis, new teachers of the law, new persons coming on the scene would often get this litmus test. Are you like Hillel? You let everybody through the loopholes, or you like Shammai? It keeps it tight. And so Jesus's answer on this passage was directly in line with Shammai. He positioned himself as a person who follows Shammai and a person who agreed with the interpretation of Shammai over Hillel. And at first glance, it sounds like, Jesus was stricter because Shammai seemed stricter.
I want to take a minute and say thank you to the recording service that has made this podcast possible, Riverside. When I started my podcast, I had literally no idea what I was doing, and I just wanted a single way to record, edit, and share content without wasting time on different platforms. Then a friend suggested Riverside to me, and I'll tell you what, it was literally an answer to prayer. With just one login, I can record my interviews with scholars, clip interview moments into Reels for Instagram and TikTok, and post directly onto my RSS feed and Spotify, all without the extra downloads, platforms, all of it. So for the curious and confused people like me, the best part is that the crew at Riverside actually listens to their users when they need help. I wanted an editing preset to save time on creating reel templates, and they listened. They literally implemented a new feature. And since using Riverside, my social clips have reached over 1 million people each month. And I haven't even unlocked all the features yet. Live streaming is going to be next. So if you're considering starting a podcast, or you just need to edit at a pro level for content or interviews, I cannot recommend Riverside enough. If this is helpful for you, I ask that you click the affiliate link I provided in the show notes description. It costs nothing extra to you, and it gives a small kickback to me, which helps the channel stay alive. Thank you so much. Now back to the show.
But Jesus was thinking of the equality for the women. They don't need to be going through frivolous things just because the man decides, this has changed about your appearance. It's time to be done. Let's find somebody newer and younger. No, that's frivolous divorce. So, and some of the grounds that Jesus cites is for why divorce is not a good plan in the first place. It's not that he's overruling Moses' allowance for a divorce, but he's saying that divorce is simply an allowance for when things are so bad that it keeps things from getting worse. Okay, Two people that are belligerent are just going to fight. Well, they're both abusing each other if they're both equally doing this to each other, or one is being abused by the other if that's not the case. But it's grounds for one or both to get a divorce, depending on what's taken place. Abuse is a good reason for a divorce, because your rights to your sanity and your rights to having somebody be a biblical example is a good thing. And a person who's being evil and pounding, beating you up emotionally or whatever is a bad example. And God's commands were for people to draw everyone to God's word. Well, a person who's doing this isn't drawing anybody to God's word. It's an abuse on the spiritual level as well, one that's often overlooked by secular thinkers on divorce. But it's an important one. Provision not only of the physical matters, but also the spiritual matters is also an important consideration. Abuse.
And the provision was stated in Exodus.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so just to summarize, because there's a lot of Jewish language going on. So again, Dr. Sedlacek, remember the Sunday school mentality that we're keeping up with here, but I appreciate the depth that you're offering, is that when the Pharisees came to Jesus with that question, it was a binary test of, are you going to answer this with the, I want to say, more liberal rabbi, or alongside the more conservative rabbi, the one that has, there is no loopholes, where the other one says there is loopholes, the ones that respect women, the ones that do protect women, that doesn't just say you looked bad today, so he has grounds for divorce. And Jesus sided with the more liberal, open-ended, and equal sounding answer of saying, listen, if a man is not providing for his woman, both physically, monetarily, and equally, those provisions are gone. She's in danger, not beyond any sexual immorality, which he just references sexual immorality. But in that answer, they knew that he was falling in a line with the more liberal rabbi.
Well, I would say the more conservative one, because he's not allowing so many loopholes. It's the one that allowed all the loopholes in there, allowing so many divorces to go through, that actually, in effect, is taking advantage of the women.
Yes, I think we're saying the same thing, just using the opposite words. But yes, okay, I agree possibly with you.
Yeah, just wanted to clarify. But so Shammai and Hillel had these really diametrically opposite views on how to interpret the Torah generally. It wasn't just on the issue of divorce. Rabbi Hillel was always looking for the loophole to do this, and Shammai is like thinking, what's the principle of this thing in the first place? This loophole doesn't really exist. And so this is the way they operated. But the effect was Hillel was allowing men to get divorces over absolutely trivial grounds, whereas Shammai was saying, no, what God has put together, let not man put asunder. So if this was a marriage before God, let's not be tearing it apart just because somebody got a change of whim or, some kind of urge to go find somebody else.
I'm sorry. How do we know that his language is siding with Himmel when he discusses this in Matthew 19?
Because he points to the grounds that are in the Torah. He doesn't list all of them, and that's where we can make an error saying, well, he didn't list that one. Maybe he is thinking not to include it, but he only was saying, in general, one of the things from the Torah should be the grounds for a divorce, not frivolous matters that aren't even mentioned in the Torah. So
got it. So we focus on the sexual. Got it. Okay. So like the nature of his response, because I'm getting so hung up on the word adultery, where that's the limiting factor. But you're saying just in the language that he uses and the structure, it's more open-ended to the conservative aspect that protects the woman, and it's not just allowing for all these loopholes. That's the way he's answering that question. We shouldn't be focusing on the adultery part of that question or his response. We should be focusing more so on the fact that he's alluding to a more conservative protection within marriages that, keep women safe with regards to provisions.
Yes. To read Matthew as excluding the other legitimate grounds for divorce would not be a good read of Matthew. Matthew's only stating one of the legitimate reasons because it's focusing the question away from what the Pharisees actually ask. They don't ask, what are the legitimate grounds for divorce? They ask, can a man, didn't ask about the woman, can a man divorce his wife for any reason at all? Yes or no?
So and he answers with no, not any reason, for very specific reasons that do not help the woman out. Got it. Okay, it's clicking for me. We got there in 30 minutes, but we got there.
He takes their mind away from what they're worried about and focuses instead on the things that actually protect women. So
got it.
Yeah.
Jesus was a feminist. Yes. I'd be happy for more of the rabbinical debate, but I think just for, again, the Sunday school mentality is like, okay, so moving forward with this truth that divorce is okay on the grounds of provision in ways that are conservative, that are not frivolous, that if a man is not providing and it's a good reason to divorce, grounds for adultery and abuse. Yes, absolutely. God does not want you in that. That's a good reason. does he have views on marriage after divorce? I know that there are a lot of verses that talk about like women that get remarried many times. Whose wife is she? Are there any legitimacies or marriages that last forever because he was my first husband? I'm always going to be married to him no matter who I marry after. This is how I'm interpreting this verse, but what's the correct way?
So all Jesus is doing there is countering the idea that in the afterlife, we need to figure out which person she belongs to. There's no need.
Yes.
That's all he's
Oh,
saying. There's no need to be connecting her to the first husband, the second husband, the third husband. It's irrelevant in the afterlife. So it's like they come to him with this interesting practical application problem that they've devised based on a potential situation, which we don't know if anybody actually fits. But here's the potential situation, the straw man argument. They come to him with it, and he's saying, this isn't relevant. I don't know why you're asking this. In the afterlife, nobody is giving in marriage. So people exist as individuals.
Man, I am the Pharisees, it feels like. I'm asking the same exact questions as them. I'm way too legalistic, but I'm again curious. And I think that isn't Jesus so amazing that he reshapes the way that we think? He reshapes the way that we see things, that he declutters the things that we get so caught up in. Like, how beautiful is that?
It reminds me of the question that he's asked when they go catch a woman in adultery. John chapter 8. They catch this woman, and I have to think, what mentality has to be true for an individual that actually goes around catching people? I don't know. But anyway, they find somebody. Did they set her up in a sting operation? I don't know. But here they come. They bring her. She's caught in the act of adultery. She's standing there before Jesus. What do they want him to do? They want him to interpret the Torah. That is all they really want him to do. The Torah says that a person who's caught in adultery should be stoned to death. Obviously, Jesus doesn't stone her to death. So what was his answer? He can't answer them, do nothing, because that violates the Torah. He can't answer them, stone her to death, because there's a real problem that nobody's going to address if he says to do that. What he does? Option C. He bends down in the dirt and starts drawing in the dirt. Doesn't answer their question. They're insistent. They're upset. What do we do with this woman? He says, whoever one of you has never sinned, cast the first stone. That reshapes
But the law
argument.
says.
The law says it, but the law also expects that the person who does it is just. Anyone who executes the law has to be just. They can't do it. Not one of them can do it. Doesn't matter what's in the law. They can't even fulfill it. They disappear one after the other. And then when they're all gone, he says, where's your accusers? They've left. There's no more. Neither do I condemn you. Go home and sin no more. And so when faced with A or B, Jesus answers with C, the one they're not thinking about.
Yeah.
That's a strategy he
Truly.
used a lot, actually.
And I feel like we see a lot of that even in like Job, that whole book is saying, well, you must have done something wrong. And even Elihu comes forward with a different option. And then God comes out and he's like, who are you to even tell me how this is supposed to work?
All you guys got it wrong.
Yeah.
It's
Option
different.
C. I love that. So with this thinking of only the just can bring justice, what do you have to say biblically about people that are divorced? I mean, is that something that they should be ashamed of? Is there, some sort of forgiveness that needs to be had for ending a marriage and thinking about getting remarried? Like, what would be the disposition of that person, and how should their heart posture be towards the grace that they're asking for from God?
I think any person can be repentant and receive grace for anything they've done. It doesn't matter if it's the issue of divorce or some other issue. It always can be given. The issue that comes to play in remarriage, I've seen a number of remarriages that worked out great. Like, for example, the divorces were something that happened rapidly after their first marriages. These were terrible relationships. They ended up in divorce. They did get remarried, and then they had a wonderful relationship. And it was a clue to those who look on that there was something beneficial about that second marriage. I've also seen some where there was repeat remarriages, and finally singleness because they couldn't find somebody that they really got along with. And that points often to a personal problem as much as a social problem. It's hard to say if their remarriages were a good thing in that case. It's hard to say. For me, it's difficult to form what is a perfect response to someone who's gotten divorced and wishes to remarry, because we don't actually get a full theology in the text. We have some legitimate grounds for divorce under rabbinical law, under the Torah, and with those, a person was free to remarry. Most of Christendom or Christianity doesn't operate under rabbinical law. So how does that work? How do we make it work? It's something that's too sticky of a problem for most of us as churches to deal with. On the practical level, a person can't sit in this position of being divorced and wanting to remarry with a huge unknown. And that's the impractical solution. They don't know. Can I
What do
get
you mean
married?
a
Can I
big...
not? That
Wait,
one.
what do you
Can I
mean?
get
What's the issue with the unknown?
Yeah, can I get married or can I not? Is it legitimate? It's a big question. So
Right.
if a divorce wasn't on one of the legitimate grounds, then a remarriage is non-legitimate. That's the take that you get from reading Jesus' interaction with Torah. But it's hard to define whether or not somebody's civil marriage that never was involved with rabbis making a get for them, if theirs is the same level of legitimacy. It's hard to know that. It's hard to decide that. So the different church denominations handle this differently. In my own, what we do is if somebody wants to go into ministry and they have a divorce before and they're married to their second partner or whatever, we have a lot more investigation we want to do to make sure, one, the old divorce is really done and over, because that was one of the issues in the rabbinical thing. Because, if you still got a backdoor way into the first spouse, it's not over. And the other thing is that the new marriage is actually solid, because stability in a home, stability in partners is actually a positive thing. And so you want to make sure of that, extra careful when you've got somebody who's had a divorce and a remarriage. And maybe that's where the practical thing is. Whatever kind of wisdom we can derive from God's word to kind of ask people and probe a little bit. A lot of times in especially American society, we like to think, well, that was my business. And I don't want anybody probing into that thing. But the thing is for an organization, which the best answer is to not get divorced in the first place, still wanting to be, how do I put it, giving grace to other humans who've had a mishap, still wanting to include them at all levels of the worship with a divorce on their hands and a remarriage. At least be open and honest about all of this in a group where it's safe. And so, like people seeking a ministry, we have one of those groups. Everybody that's going to become a minister of any level goes through the group and deals with a lot of things. It's not just about divorces and remarriage. It's about finance. It's about attitudes and gifts and dispositions and a whole bunch of things. But that will be a piece if they have a divorce. And it's not needed if there's not been one. So that's
interesting.
The other thing. That's a kind of a practical response to this, because one of the things that Jesus cites is let a man, well, even in rabbinical sources, the purpose of a marriage is to have a marriage for life and to not put asunder what God puts together. Bad things happen. We have to be real. Bad things do happen, and you have to do the best thing left, whatever that thing is. Out of all the options in front of us, we have to do the best decision with whatever's left of the pieces. And that can be tricky to do. It can be tricky. And to a certain extent, we have to understand people, understand where they've been, what they went through. I know somebody who was in a very abusive relationship, and they thought that getting a divorce itself was a sin. And it took half the church to convince them that you're being abused. It's probably, and you don't want to say certainly, but it's probably the best thing to do out of all the options in front of you.
But I feel for that person, because for me, to have fear of God is like, well, I'd rather suffer in this abusive relationship than do something against, something I could have prevented. Like, I chose to get divorced, and that's on me. So I'm saying I absolutely follow that thinking. But one of my follow-up questions was like, okay, then like, what are the grounds? Like, if I'm a Gentile, what is it? But I think what you said just now of like, what is the best solution? Like, the goal is to stay married, but maybe staying married isn't the best solution. And I know people are going to want to like have exactly what is and exactly what isn't, what is the black and what is the white. But I mean, sexual immorality, adultery, abuse, I feel like a lot of things fall within that. Am I missing anything there?
No. And the other thing is within two persons, forgiveness can play a role between the two of them too. But it also needs to be probably with some oversight, because it's easy for one person to say, oh yeah, I forgave them, when reality is therapy was what they needed. And the thing is
yeah.
Enablers, we have such a thing, enablers. So
true.
I know people who've enabled their children to be alcoholics. It can happen. You can enable a problem that didn't exist previously. So this kind of thing can happen as well. And so, but genuine forgiveness is still an option. And sometimes it's overlooked. It may not be possible. That's the other thing. You have to be honest with it.
Yeah, and that makes me think like today, I see a lot of people that enable a lot of people not putting in the hard work just because something's hard. They're now entitled to get out of it rather than work hard for something to work through. So it makes me think like today's culture, he's not making as much money as you thought, so he's a broke man, I can leave him. And it's like, well, I think that you married him for a reason. Like, that's worth something that you can work on. That's not abuse. Like, I think people go through ups and downs. Like, I'm just making up that example. But it makes me think, if we put ourselves in the shoes of those first century Jews, what were the impacts of like Jewish versus like Roman laws that played a role in divorce at that time?
Yeah. There's several considerations in the ancient world that don't apply to today. One is that it was very easy for a divorced person to be turned into slavery.
What?
Mm-hmm. So if a person became divorced and had no means, no way to procure a business, no way to procure land, they could easily fall into slavery. And so the ethical thing to do was to prevent these things.
By staying married.
That's far less likely to be a concern nowadays. But in the Roman Empire especially, this was a common concern. Indebtedness was a key path to slavery. So if a person is without financial resources and ends up in a frivolous divorce, well, okay, now they're on their path to slavery, more than likely.
So that would be kind of the argument for why people would stay married.
And why churches would be very insistent that certain divorce cases would be actually harmful, not helpful to the situation.
I don't mean to be extreme here, but I might say something extreme is like women not being able to have their own credit card, women not being able to make the same amount of their husbands. That's a very recent thing that has changed. I haven't really been rushed to get married because I've been able to provide for myself. I haven't needed a man to get a credit card.
Right.
I don't want to say it's the same thing, but it kind of is of like, why would I divorce my husband in 1930 if it was just going to leave me, kind of kicked out on the streets by myself? Whereas like now I can get divorced and still be able to make an income, maybe even more than my ex-husband.
Yeah. And these are concerns that play a role in some of these society protection things that are going on in Jewish law. and in the way the early church handled situations. Yeah, they
Yeah,
wanted to prevent, and this is the same reason, like in the book of James, where it kind of brings out the rich landlords who will want to try court cases on people who were struggling to pay rent. Well, what would happen? The renter ends up enslaved. So the church was
mm,
like, no, let's handle this at the church for
mm.
believers, a believer who's renting and a believer who's the landlord. Let's handle this at church. At least the church can pull some money together and help out the renter and keep him out of slavery. Yeah,
Whoa.
it
See,
was a big
this is,
thing.
I love these conversations because how was I supposed to know the societal context of those laws? Because when you read it as a Sunday school Christian, I'm just going to keep using the term, is you say, okay, God said don't do that, so he can't do that. No explanation. Just cut off the top of the turkey because that's what we do in this household. You know what I mean? Like I'm referring to that story where each year
Three
they cut off the top of the
generations ago,
turkey.
it was the pot
Yeah, they're
size.
like,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah, that was just the size of the oven. That's why we did it. And this just puts so much more color into it. And I think creates more freedom in our faith of like, oh, our God is not here just to put rules on us that are stagnant and have no limits. Like that's what made sense at that time. And we have a living word. And Jesus was very reflective of the space that he's granting to us. But without the context of why he needed to grant that space in the first place, from Matthew to Exodus, we kind of lose that reasoning. Like that thread is completely lost.
And something that slips most people's imaginations is just how patriarchal the Roman society was. We don't realize how much it was different from typical Jewish society and even typical Greek society until you really go digging in the materials, the philosophers' notes and letters going back and forth between people. But Rome was far more patriarchal than Greek or Jewish cultures. Um, and so, by saying that, women's rights were limited in the first century according to the Roman imperial court, or even cult, I might say, than it was even in biblical things or in Jewish things or Greek things. And so there was an oppression that was starting to really pile down, and it increases itself as you go from the first century to the fourth century. I mean, just reading St. Augustine on women is an eye-opener for those of us who think that the Torah was rough. The Torah was actually protecting women.
That is such a wild thought. When you as in me, don't come from a historical background, you I am thinking, oh well, before the women's movement, it was just a very misogynistic society. Women had no rights, they didn't have any freedoms. So you group all of those societies into that same patriarchal society. And arguably today, but I think women have much more rights today. But I would have never said that, oh yeah, it was just because I just simply don't know the history. So I generalize and I assume, and now that's the frames at which I view that.
Yeah. And one of the things that's happened in both, we talked earlier about science, but that we won't say more about science right now, except to think that both science, history as a science, and biblical studies and even anthropology have assumed that we've been on this linear path. Nobody wants to admit or consider just how many ups and downs there have been in those timelines. And there's been many. There's
Yes.
been civilization
Yes.
collapses, rebirths. There's been ups and downs decline on a lot of these things. And Roman Empire, not Roman Republic, that's the same country, we think, but it's totally different once it becomes an empire. Once the Caesar and the Caesars becoming God in their imagination becomes a thing, it flips Roman society. It flips pagan society. And this is the context that the early church is growing in, is a flipped pagan society that's now very patriarchal. And it wasn't
Whoa.
before.
Eee. You might have to come back on to talk about that. That is so many levels that just like I don't exist in that society. How am I supposed to think like that and then interpret literature in that? That is just so difficult. But I'm so grateful that you're able to unpack it and kind of break it down easily. That's a whole other conversation. I do want to end on something that is more applicable today. And you might have already answered it, to be honest, but just for the people that currently exist within a church that is very anti-divorce, obviously you've just broken down that there's a lot more leniency in it. Once you understand the Torah, like Jesus does want to protect us. He does want marriage to last, but like he doesn't want people to suffer. And he wants to have a valid reason for divorce, not frivolous, but also a choice of protection. Sorry. How can pastors and churches that are against divorce, how do we encourage them? How do we support people going through divorce that are saying, I'm going to go to hell if I get a divorce? Like, where do we, with this knowledge, move forward and support others?
It's difficult sometimes to convince leaders to change how they view things, because whatever formed their opinion still does. And one thing we can do is point to where there are gray areas and where there are incomplete statements, because incomplete statements can be interpreted more than one way. You saw what I did with Matthew after reading Mark. Jesus' statement in Matthew is incomplete. He didn't cite every Torah example. He cited only one to point to the fact that it's Torah that should decide this, not frivolity that should decide this matter. And so by proxy, that includes anything else that is in the Torah. Those would have been a wide range of things that could have been mentioned there, and he could have mentioned them. He may, in fact, did mention them, but Matthew only records the one as a cover for all the others. That's another thing that we often miss. But if we can't change their minds about something, we can still be supportive and provide healing presences and even counseling to people who not only have had the strife and the turmoil of a divorce and maybe a remarriage, but the strife of church angst when other church leaders came down on them in a way that misinterpreted the text. And sometimes just being a healing presence for people is very helpful, because sometimes the stress from that is greater than the stress of what caused things to happen in the first place. I try to think of it as spiritual pain or spiritual stress over things can be massive, because if a person doesn't have a way to know, okay, where does the fence stop? Then they're always stressed about where is the fence. I don't know where it is, and I don't know what side of that fence I'm on. And that's not a good place to be.
Well, it's just hard when you don't know the literature to the depth that you do, that you're like, well, who am I to even decide where the fence is? I might be a mile off, and I want to make sure that I'm still within the realm. So I'm just going to play it safe and never get divorced and just endure the suffering and have this shame. Like, there are extremities to this, because you're trying to assume the best. You're trying to avoid any sort of mishap of reading your own interpretation into the text. It's a really funny dance that we do that makes me so grateful for access to like your knowledge and just this network of people that have spent time in it that can easily explain it. And I trust that judgment. And the fact that the Holy Spirit has brought us together, like, I feel like there's a lot of elements that are trying to guide us to truth here versus like my own interpretation that's completely guided by the world and my own flesh and like what works best for me. But it's just so funny, because even creating these questions, a lot of the questions that I sent ahead of time for this conversation are like, okay, so how do we help people? It's really based in this, like, this is wrong. So how do we help people go through the wrong thing? And this entire conversation has flipped the view on divorce of like, it's not wrong. God wants us to be protected. He wants us to be loved. Divorce is a bad thing, but so is abuse and, misusing your partner. Like, God wants us to be safe and loved. And even what you're saying now of like, we need to hold space and protect them and be patient with them and support them through an incredibly personally difficult time. It reminds me of a conversation I had with Rabbi Michael Apoth. And he was, like, what are we going to do to bring the Jews home back to their Messiah? And he said, as Christians, we make them jealous, which is a really ridiculous thing for us to do. But like, be so in love with our Creator and have such a great relationship with them that they say, wait, I want that. And I feel like what you're saying now is like, that is what we're called to do to our brothers, our Christians and non-Christian brothers and sisters. We support them. That's what we do. We do not condemn or convict them.
No, that's the Holy Spirit's job, not ours. If we can remember that And remember what our job is. I think we solve a lot of those problems.
Yeah, I don't want more jobs. I got enough.
Me too. Plenty hats. Give
I'm
me another.
I'm busy. I don't want that. Judging? No, I don't have time for that. That's someone else's job.
And then here's the thing. Let's say the Holy Spirit is convicting somebody that they are sinning and that they sinned and that they need to help show them how to repent. I mean, finding grace for the situation is sometimes one of the roles that we as Christians can fill, as being ministers of grace to others, vessels of grace to others, conduits of grace to others. God's grace is big. We need to extend it to others. And
absolutely.
Sometimes we get tangled around things because we have an idea. But if that stops us from extending grace, we probably have the wrong idea.
Oh, that's good.
It's just a practical thing. Because we're supposed to be extending grace to people.
It is a practical thing, but sometimes you just got to say it. Just saying out loud makes it just land a little bit better.
Even if the idea as a theoretical concept was solid, the idea to convey this thing as a judgment to somebody else isn't.
Yikes. That's really calling out a lot of people and the power that they think they hold as Christians, telling people what they can and can't do.
Yeah, it may do that. That's not my aim. My aim is to guide people into better conduits of grace.
Yeah. Yes. Dr. Sedlacek, again, another amazing conversation. And like I said before, I'm going to bother you after this to bring you back on for some of the other things we've discussed in the past. But last time we discussed, you were talking about some business that you're building that helps pastors really reinvigorate their understanding of the Torah that maybe seminary didn't provide. Are you still moving forward with that? Or what's the status on that? Can people access you? Are you teaching?
I am doing classes. I can talk about that. Several of the things I was working on are kind of on hold temporarily due to some situations I don't want to discuss here. But the plan is to keep moving forward on this. So, cool. Yes, that is something that's potentially developing.
I love that. Well, I can't wait to hear where that goes. I can't wait to have you back on. But as always, thank you so much for your time on a Sunday evening. And I'm so excited for us to discuss again very soon. Thank you so much, Dr. Sedlacek.